All right, so for the final afternoon session of today, we are going to start with Hugh Lee talking to us about working from home, productivity, and firm dynamics.
All right, thank you very much. It's great to be here. Thank the organizers for putting this paper on the program. This is a rather preliminary work, so I'm really looking forward to feedback. So just a little bit of context about how we started this project. So I'm from the productivity, growth, firm dynamics literature. So the way we're thinking about this is that work from home, after the pandemic, there was a shift in work from home technology. And of course, there might have also been changes in worker preferences. And we're interested in seeing how this affects firms' production process going forward, especially since that work from home seems to have came down, but still at a level that's higher than pre-pandemic. So we're thinking of this as a steady state phenomenon. And so right now, we are using a French data set to try to explore how workers and firm match in terms of propensity to work. And from that, we're trying to now build a model to get the story right and to draw implications for productivity and firm dynamics. So that's where we are right now. So first, just to summarize some of the empirical facts that we've established with this database. So the database we have is similar to the one, it's actually, part of the data is exactly the same as the one that we saw, the matching of the FAR and the DATS database, pardon my pronunciation. But to that data set, we also match from a worker labor force survey on worker level response to the questions, do you work from home? So then we can look at a worker and see what is the propensity of a worker to work from home, conditional on the worker's characteristics and conditional on the firm characteristics for the firm that they work for. And what we found so far in the data is that workers that work for younger firms, larger firms, and firms that are more productive in the sense of revenue productivity, they have a higher propensity to report work from home. And then also workers that work from home also report to have higher wages. And I will show you that these patterns seem to be robust for controlling for various firm and worker characteristics that we can measure in this data set. So that's most of the things I'll show you today. And then towards the end, I'll show you a very simple model about how we're starting to think about rationalizing these facts. So that part is very much in progress. OK. Empirical findings. So let me talk about the data a little bit. It's great that Filippo already talked about the firm side. So on the firm side, we have the same data set. So on the worker side, we have a labor force survey. The survey is long, but in terms of both availability of the work from home question, also data quality, we're restricting this to 2014 to 2022. 2023 is now available to us, so we're working on extending the time period. So after all the cleaning that I'm matching to the firm level data set, we have about 30,000 workers per year, and we have a little bit over 200,000 worker year observations. So the data set is a little bit interesting. This is a labor force survey. A worker is tracked for a year, and we see them for 4 quarters. The question about do you work from home, we have at a quarterly year level, but the firm data set we have at the year level. So this 213,000 is the number of worker year that we see in this database. And from the worker labor force survey, we can see the workers' characteristics like demographics, education, occupation. We can also see their earnings and hours, which allows us to construct wages. On the firm side, we match the worker to the firm using a firm identifier. The great thing about this data set, which is one reason we chose it, is in that in the labor force survey, they actually have an establishment ID, which made matching to the firm really easy. So once we match the firm, then we see for that worker what is the firm characteristic, all the things that we saw before. We can see firm size, we can see firm age, we can calculate revenue TFP, we can see industry of the firm. And then in addition, because we have this firm ID, or establishment ID, we can then also match to this data database that we saw earlier that has information about the rest of the worker that's working for that firm. So we can control for some other characteristics. So far, we haven't used that feature that much. The one that I'll show you today is about the CEO. I think anecdotally, CEO may affect whether a firm offers work from home or not. So there we try to control for some of the CEO characteristics, which we get from this stats database. OK. So the question is, how do we measure work from home? Before I got into this, I didn't think that was tricky, but it seems like a tricky thing. All right, so the exact survey question, this is my co-author's translation from French. So the question is, how often do you work from home during the last 4 quarters? And you're asked to choose one answer only, which is good because the choices are not mutually exclusive. So the first one is 100%. So be it home is my only workplace. This will be fully remote. And then you have less than 100%, but greater or equal to 50%. And then the third one is 0%. Sorry. The second one is greater or equal to 50%. I put the less than 100% because I imagine a worker that works 100% would choose 1 if given only one choice. And then the third one is positive, that you work from home. And then the last choice is 0%. So the overall response to the entire questionnaire, the response rate is about 70%. But conditional on responding to the questionnaire, the answer to this question, almost all respondents respondent of the questionnaire responds to this question. So the non-response rate is very low, but we drop those non-responses. OK, so first I'd like to show you in this data what happened to just overall share of workers that work from home in France. So we divide the data in 2 groups. The left-hand side, A, that's the workers that respond, I do work a little bit from home, but less than 50%. And we saw that increase during the pandemic. It started increasing before the pandemic, and then it continued to increase. It dropped slightly during the onset of the pandemic, and then we think that maybe that's related to some of these workers actually moved to fully remote, which is on the right-hand side. So right-hand side is the workers that respond, yes, I work more than 50%. So that was basically 0 before the pandemic, and then really shot up during the pandemic. And now it has dropped down a little bit, but on both types of work from home, we see that the data right now has settled at a level that's much higher than what it was before the pandemic. OK. So let me show you some summary statistics that we get from this data set. So because of the data set, we see a worker, and for that worker, we see the worker's characteristics and the firm's characteristics. So the summary statistics I divided into 2 groups. The top one is on the worker side, and the panel below is firms. So first, we have age of the worker. So we basically restrict the data. So the data set covers workers from, I think, 17 to 80 something. But we kind of restrict the data set to firm workers that are actually working. So that's why you see the oldest, the percentile, that's like 63. And then we cover also some of the younger workers. At the bottom, it's like 90 years old. So I guess these might be university students doing part-time jobs. I don't know. And then we have about 38% of these workers are female. It could be because labor force participation rate for female is lower. So conditional working, the share of workers that's female might be lower. We have about 33% of workers that have a university degree. And then we also have a measure of young children. The reason we put it in because we think that might be related to whether you choose to work from home or not. And about 11% of these workers have young children being below 3 years old or below. And then now on the firm side, these are some variables that we thought would be interesting to look at. So first is firm size, measured by firm employment. Because on the firm side, like Filippo showed, we have basically like a census type data for the firm. So we have a very wide firm size distribution. And then on the age, so age is measured by years since registration. So it goes from like new firms, like 1 year old to all the way to like over 100 years old. And then we can construct revenue productivity and value per worker for these data sets. We also looked at some variables that we thought might be interesting. For example, we looked at what is the value of your building over total assets, because maybe depending on whether you own your building or you're renting, maybe the offering of work from home could differ by firm. And then finally, we construct the CEO age and CEO, whether it's gender. The way we identify CEO is that in the DATS data, there's a code if you're the CEO of the firm. And if that code is missing, we just infer that from the highest paid employee for the firm. And there we can also control for the CEO characteristic in that way. Okay. So the first type of regression we ran is to regress your status from the worker for work from home, worker characteristic and firm characteristic. So for the regressions I show you today, we basically, the left-hand side is a dummy. That's 1 if you do any type of work from home. So if your answer is 1, 2, or 3 in the survey. And then for the all the regressions that I'll show you now, we'll control for industry times survey, year, quarter, fixed effect, and occupation, year, quarter, fixed effect. Our industry measure is next 3 digits, so we have about 220 industries. So an example of an industry would be, I guess, book publishing versus movie publishing, so within publishing different types. And then for occupation, we have about 450 occupations. Economist would be an occupation. Okay. So here, just controlling for industry and time and controlling for employment, this graph shows how the worker's propensity to work from home relates to employer's age. So on the left-hand side, the leftmost graph, that's any work from home. And we see a decline in propensity for the worker to work from home and the firm age. When we divide it into the intensity of work from home, whether it's less than 50% or 50% or more, we still see this relationship that firms, the workers that work for younger firms have a higher propensity to work from home. This graph is size. So for here, we control industry and survey time fixed effect, as well as the age of the firm. So if we just look at any work from home, larger firms, workers that work for larger firms have a higher propensity to work from home. But if we divide it by intensity, the figure is a little bit different. So if it's hybrid, but less than 50%, we see this increase with firm employment. But if we go to fully remote, or 50% or more, actually the relationship is not that clear. We also looked at how this relationship changed over time. So the red line is when the pandemic hit. What we saw is that before the pandemic, the relationship between work from home and employer's age is basically 0. We didn't find any significant relationship. But since the pandemic, that relationship has become more and more negative. And on the size dimension, before the pandemic, there were some positive relationship driven by, I think, workers that were working slightly from home. There was some positive relationship, but this relationship also increased over time. Okay, so we found this relationship between workers' propensity to work from home, firm age, and firm size. So we wanted to, the next step we thought was to figure out what's the story for it. So what we did was try to control for various things that we think might be explaining it. And right now, we didn't find anything that explained everything away. So that's why we're going to a model with adoption cost for work from home. But let me show you what kind of controls we've already thrown in the data. So column 1 is just regressing propensity for the worker to work from home, from age, from employment, controlling for industry and occupation, and the survey time. So we find a negative coefficient on age and a positive one on size. So we thought that maybe there's some matching between firm age and employee age. Indeed, we do find that older workers tend to work for older firms. But when we control for that, that's in the second column, we still keep the relationship we had before with firm age and firm employment. If we go all the way to column 6, that's when we throw in all the controls, including the education fixed effect. We still have this relationship between employees' propensity to work from home and the firm age and employment. So these worker side characteristics were not helping us to explain away this relationship. And I think the reason partly is that, like, for example, whether the worker is female, whether they have young children, doesn't seem to relate to firm age, which is why maybe it doesn't help us to explain the age relationship. Okay, So then we also try to control for other firm characteristics. So the first column is again the relationship between propensity to work from home, firm age, firm employment, with industry occupation controls. So we control for firm TFPR, so there's revenue productivity. That explains a little bit of the age relationship, but it appears that doesn't explain fully the relationship. And then we try to control for various other things. The one that did a little bit is the building over assets. It seems like older firms tend to have a higher building to asset ratio, so they tend to own buildings, and that explains a little bit about why younger firms tend to have a higher propensity to work from home. But overall, when we control for all of these variables, we still find this negative relationship between firm age and worker propensity to work from home, and the size relationship as well. Okay. So then the next thing we thought is CEO age. Just one anecdote, I was talking to the research director in Richmond Fed. Richmond Fed is one of the Fed that has the most flexible work from home. They have these core weeks for economists. Basically, many economists moved away from Richmond. And I asked them, like, why are you guys doing this while San Francisco Fed, we have to be 2 to 3 days in the office? And what he told me at the time is that their bank president was really supportive of work from home. So that's just one anecdote, but we thought that then maybe it's natural to just look at what CEO characteristics is, because the firm characteristics don't seem to explain away these relationships. So we added the CEO age and CEO's gender to this. They didn't really do much for these results. So I think we could explore more about the CEO characteristics, but so far it hasn't really helped us to explain these relationships. Okay. So then the other thing we wanted to think about is how wages relates to, wages of these workers relates to their work from home status, controlling for their firm and worker characteristics. The reason that we were interested in this is that we went to a model to try to explain the relationship we had before, and then it turns out the productivity effects that we draw out of the model does depend on whether remote workers are being paid more or not, or why. What are they being paid? And so then we went to the data to look at this relationship. So we construct hourly wages for these workers. We see their weekly hours, and we also see their monthly after-tax earnings. And so from this, we construct a proxy for hourly wage. And then we regress this, their work from home status, and then controlling for the characteristics of the employer, as well as the worker characteristics. So overall, we find that work from home is positively associated with wages, controlling for various things. So column 1 is when we just regress the wage on the work from home status, controlling for just industry and time fixed effects. There's like a 28% premium on work from home. That does get gradually explained away when we add more controls. So if we add just occupation controls, that explains like more than half of that away. And then once we add the worker characteristics, so these are things like education, things that you could think age, things you think that may be related to their wages, that explains another 3% away. So once we control for firm characteristics and also the area time fixed effect, overall we get about 8% premium. And when we divide the workers into university versus non-university degrees, we see similar premium, although the premium is higher for university degrees. This is some result that we thought actually might be consistent with the SWAY data. So we looked at how this hourly wage relates to just how intensely you're working from home. So we're actually finding that the hybrid workers, the ones that are working 50% or more from home, but less than 100%, they seem to have the highest premium controlling for all these fixed effects. Whereas the fully remote and the less, they are earning more than completely in office, but the differential is smaller. And we're also finding that hours seems to be positively related to your work from home status. Okay, so just to summarize, with this data set, we're finding that workers of younger firms have a higher propensity to work from home. Workers of bigger firms have a higher propensity to work from home, and then these remote workers have higher hourly wages. So the next step is kind of the more difficult one. We're trying to figure out what's the story to explain this. So I'll try to explain where we're going, and then hopefully get your feedback and tell me what the story is, makes sense or not. So on the labor demand side, we're thinking of modeling using a task-based model to try to explain these facts. So here is just a simple model of the firm. We can think that the firm faces some sort of downward sloping demand curve, but to produce, a firm has to combine tasks. So this is a task-based model. They combine tasks in order to produce. So the Z here is a firm level productivity across all different tasks, and X are different types of tasks. And there's some degree of substitution between tasks. And then to model work from home, we think that each task can be done at home or in the office. And then there is some relative productivity of work done at home and work done at the office that differ across tasks, but the same across firms. And we assume a particular functional form for this relative productivity. We use a functional form from Acemoglu and Restrepo. It's a convenient functional form. It rules out like weird solutions. And then, so I think our story right now is about the cost of adoption. So we're thinking that since the pandemic, there was technology improvement that lowered the cost of work from home, but that might have been different by firm. So here we're thinking of adoption cost that has a component that could be firm dependent. So if you adopt from any types of work from home, you have to pay a fixed cost, and that's firm specific. And then there could be some cost that's increasing with the degree of working from home. And based on this, we can combine with a firm's profit maximization problem, where the firm is choosing how much labor of work from home and work from office to put in for each task to maximize the static profit. And then adoption cost that rationalizes our finding is that first, if there is a fixed component to adoption cost, then the more productive firms, they are bigger, have more revenue, and can cover this fixed cost. That will rationalize why larger firms tend to adopt more. And then on the adoption cost for younger firms, this is part where we're not really sure about this. I think the story we have right now is that maybe younger firms, because they don't have a fixed structure of management already, maybe there's less cost of adjustment, so that this fixed cost is lower for them. And if we plug this into the model, we can sort of qualitatively generate what we see in the data, that more productive firms, they tend to have higher employment. And once you get above certain size, you choose to adopt work from home. And then for younger firms, this shifts to the left because they have a lower fixed cost. So this is the kind of model we're going with. On the supply side, we're not really sure how to model this right now in order to rationalize why higher wage work from home workers tend to have higher wages. Okay, so to conclude, we have these facts about worker propensities, relationship with age, size, of the firms they work for. The work in progress right now is to build a story to rationalize these facts. Thank you. I look forward to your feedback.
Questions. One, in the French context, would firms be able to pay a differential worker in the same job to workers, some of whom work remotely and some don't? Or would they be constrained by regulations or collective bargaining agreements from doing that? I
see. For the characteristics that we're able to control for, they're being paid differently based on their work from home status.
But that could be, yeah, but you're not comparing people within a firm.
We did run for the firms, for firms where we see multiple workers, we did run within the firm. And then we did see a differential for the observables that we see. But it's true that there might be unobservables to explain that, but we did try to run this within firm for the firms where we have multiple workers that we observe.
It would be good to just tell us what the French legal and wage setting environment is like.
Okay.
So we have some sense of the scope for compensating differentials to operate, for example.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Yep.
So, yeah, I'm we can talk more later, but I had a couple of things. One is I think I would encourage you to do more of the empirical stuff, either creating a measure of that is more of the intensity of working from home, or at least exploiting a little bit more the hybrid versus fully remote versus fully in person. And I mean, our sense is that it's basically different jobs or potentially different firms in your context that are offering hybrid versus fully remote jobs. And so I think your binary, is there work from home or not, is probably not going to capture that.
Yeah, yeah. We can definitely do that.
Yeah, so yeah. I think that's easy, and I think it would exploit some more of the richness of what you have on the empirical side.
Yeah, conditional work from home, we do have a variable on days work from home that they report.
Exactly.
So that's something we can also do. Yeah.
Exactly. And so the other sort of broader question that I had is in some of your descriptive stuff, you brought in some of the financial variables, like what does the asset composition look like? I think, so that one I'm better. I think I understand why having more buildings relative to less buildings can matter, but I don't know if you had a story for why you wanted to bring in some of the more financial data.
So when we found the relationship with, say, age, we wanted to have an explanation for it. Especially, we do find a relationship between, say, age and TFP. So if we understand the story of why younger firms tend to have higher propensity to work from home, that will help us understand what the predictive effect is. So the reason we looked at building to asset is to see if that could be something that helped us to explain that. It does a little bit, but not a lot. That's the main reason we were looking at those variables. It was more of a brainstorming to see what could help us find the story.
Yeah, I guess, so that makes total sense. I guess my underlying comment is kind of, what are the technological or institutional frictions that would lead you to predict a relationship between working from home and some of these variables? I think that's the question you should be asking.
Yes, I mean, for building to asset, it's just that if there's some frictions from selling your building, so maybe it's cheaper. Yeah, yeah.
Or pure technology, like old economy versus new economy.
Yeah.
Great. So two thoughts. One is in France. I think there's a paper I read recently called I think it's called "Sick of Working from Home." It's about work from home, and I think does anyone know this? Eric Moran and isn't that right? It's some LSE folks, but. The reason I raised it is they're French data, and there's some regulation, I can't remember the details in France, whereby they use it as an instrument, you have to kind of offer work from home to your employees if you have this thing, and that was signed pre-pandemic. So a bunch of firms signed up to this regulation, which pre-pandemic was a nothing. And then suddenly, if the pandemic happens, it basically is kind of an instrument in France, so it'd be worth looking at that, and I don't know for Filippo as well, whether it's of any use, but I think it's Eric Moran has this paper. I was also going to relate to that. You have panel data, so you can look at. Are you looking at changes over time?
So we haven't fully explored that part yet. So the panel is kind of a weird structure. We don't follow the same worker for more than a year. So we have them for 4 quarters. So maybe I was actually thinking with the return to office, if the announcement happens, say, during the year and things happen quickly enough, then we might be able to pick it up, the change for the same worker. But yeah, exactly. It's a short panel for each worker. The firm, we have a long panel, but the worker itself is short.
Got it. Yeah. And then the other thing, relate kind of on why workers, even controlling for all observables, you still have a pay on work from home. I mean, one thing maybe on Steve's point on compensating differential, their unobserved ability, and you pay them off by giving them better amenities. The other thing maybe you often hear that companies don't enforce fully, and if you're a high-performing employee, they kind of turn a blind eye and let you work from home, and if you're a low-performing employee, they use it. I mean, that's the story I've heard over some of these RTOs. It's not only a way to headcount reduce, but it's also a way to clear up particularly low performers. Because high performers, you just kind of ignore the RTO, but low performers, so I don't know whether that's also...
That's kind of the story we're thinking, and we think it's interesting because it has implications for the aggregate productivity effect, because there's some sort of matching between worker productivity and the tasks, the high productivity for work from home. That's a story we're thinking, but we don't have evidence to show that, but yeah, that's actually the story we're thinking. Yeah, thank you.
All right. So next we have Arpit talking to us about how whether startups benefit from remote work.
They do. Yeah, the answer is yes.
You can go back down at this point.
All right, thank you so much for having me here. It's a real pleasure to present this paper. This is joint with Abhinav, no relation, and Elena, both at UNC. All right, so you've kind of all heard about the Amazon story, right? So Amazon is kind of moving to an RTO, going back 5 days a week to the office. And that's sort of in contrast to what a lot of startups are doing, who are instead kind of embracing remote work. And this kind of raises the idea of whether remote work works differently for startups and young companies compared to established firms. Now, I think there are a lot of good reasons to think that startups might be especially affected by remote work when you look at the trends that have been going on over the last several years. So this is from Decker and Haltiwinger, and they kind of find that applications for likely startups have been going up a lot in the post-pandemic period. Now, I don't think these have yet been realized, so it kind of remains to be seen what other data sources show about this increase in startup activity. But what they also show is kind of in the cross-section, these increases in likely startup activities are really concentrated in remote-friendly occupations like tech. So a lot of things happened over the pandemic. However, when you look at things like transportation and warehouses, the increase in startup activity in those sectors kind of went up a bit and then kind of came back down, whereas in high tech, this increase in startup activity has been really elevated. So that leads us to our research question, which is to think about how does remote work impact labor scaling and productivity comparing startups and established firms. So we think these are two really important outcome variables that help track the success of companies, right? We think that the firms of tomorrow are going to be the startups of today that kind of grow and scale to a much larger extent. And productivity is, of course, important to establish for companies overall. So we're going to kind of compare how do these different types of firms fare on these important outcome measures as they go into remote work. And ex ante, this wasn't an obvious question to us. So startups have a lot of advantages in terms of flexibility and adaptability. However, large established companies also have a lot of resources, potentially market power. And so it's not clear how remote work affects different types of firms. However, understanding this question, I think, is pretty important because, one, it plays into this potential reversal of declining business dynamism. So Decker and Haltiwinger had sort of shown before the pandemic that there was this sort of declining trend of startup activity. That's been kind of reversed in recent years. So to the extent this is coming from some durable advantage that startups have, that sort of suggests that we might have a reversal of this trend, which should be good for productivity growth and economy-wide productivity in general. And it's also important for kind of broader future of work questions, right? So are we going to have this bigger shift into more flexible distributed organizational structures if startups in particular are able to take advantage of remote work opportunities? So to answer this question, we put together sort of French-like data in the US by connecting labor market flows from LinkedIn. So we have basically everyone on LinkedIn. So all the employees, all the firms, so that allows us to get a really good comprehensive sample of both employees and firms. We link this at the individual level to a measure of productivity from GitHub. So this is not a perfect measure of productivity. We'll talk about what we can measure, but it's a way of understanding one important component of skilled white-collar productivity, which is how tech workers are managing their GitHub contributions. And then we measure remote work at the firm level using Scoop. And all these data sets are kind of been kind of connected together. And so this is still pretty preliminary research, so really looking forward to all your feedback on this. So then we'd use event studies and difference designs to find that startups do, in fact, do better with remote work. They scale a lot faster compared, remote startups scale faster both relative to non-remote startups and also relative to other remote established firms. So there's some unique advantage that startups have in scaling when they go remote. And they also see higher productivity. So remote work seems to be particularly beneficial for these startup companies. When we look at why this seems to be the case, we emphasize the key factor being the ability of startups to access multiple geographic locations. So large established companies already have offices in multiple cities, right? So they can already tap into multiple labor pools already. Startups, by accessing remote work, can now tap into that same national labor pool, whereas before they were restricted to only their own local office. So we think this multi-location startup feature makes them more able to scale faster and be more productive. We also look at other factors which might be going on here. So we find that remote work seems to work better when teams are flat. So you can think of that as corresponding to fewer managerial frictions. We also look at financial frictions coming from leasing expenses. So I thought this would be really important. We find sort of mixed evidence for this channel. And we also sort of find evidence for sort of labor match quality being important because the ex-ante quality of these employees isn't necessarily great that the remote startups are hiring, i.e. in terms of education level or prior contributions on GitHub. These are not great workers, but when they join this firm, it seems like the firm experiences higher overall productivity growth, right? So that's sort of a sign that match quality is kind of the key thing going on here, rather than just the attribute of the worker in isolation. All right, so lots of people have, including this room, have thought about these types of questions. I think the main ways that we're trying to contribute are by looking at a much bigger sense of the cross-section that allows us to look at some of these labor flows, as well as productivity across many firms, and focusing in particular on startups. All right, so we're kind of able to put together this pretty nice data set that connects this comprehensive sample of a whole lot of different firms, basically everyone that has some employee on LinkedIn, connected at the individual level with GitHub, which gives us a proxy for individual productivity coming from both public and private commits, connected to firm-level attributes about remote work. So this kind of allows us to trace everything from the individual all the way up to their productivity, up to their labor flow. So we have everything about individuals that we have on LinkedIn, and we have a bunch of stuff from these other data sources as well. So this is not me. This is my doppelganger or nemesis. He is a professor of computer science at UC Santa Barbara. So you can see here he's a lot more productive than I am, but I have more citations. So just to illustrate, if you haven't seen it before, what GitHub sort of looks like and what data we're able to extract, right? So you can see for him right here, this is in 2022. Every dot in green sort of represents a day that he had made a commit, right, onto one different repo. And you can kind of see there at the bottom, we also have contributions to private repositories. So it's not just public code that you're sharing with everyone, but it's also private repositories, which are commonly used by firms to do their own internal processes, right? And so this private data is really important because we think this is going to allow us to get a better sense of what firms' own internal software production kind of looks like. All right, so our strategy is pretty straightforward. It's a triple diff. So we're going to look at the interactions of post, so looking pre and post pandemic, interacted with young firms under 10 years. We've also tried looking at size, and things are kind of similar. We use a size cutoff rather than an age cutoff to establish startups. And then we're going to interact that again with remote. So we're going to take a 0 to 1 measure of the fraction of the week that the firm allows their employees to kind of work from home, right? And so we're going to be interested in that triple interaction of how does our outcome variable, things like employee growth rate and GitHub commits, vary when we look, comparing before and after pandemic from remote, non-remote firms and comparing old versus young firms, controlling for firm fixed effects and time fixed effects. All right, so first thing we find is that remote startups do in fact scale faster. So when we look at that triple interaction, we see that these startups that are remote after the pandemic are growing a lot faster, and that's driven both by the fact that more employees are joining these startups and also that fewer people are leaving these startups. So all of those things add up to a really substantial increase in the rate at which these remote startups are able to scale after the pandemic compared to before. By contrast, if you just look at all firms in general, so that's just the interaction of post by remote, we have a much smaller effect on the overall growth rate. So the scaling factor really seems to be disproportionately focused on the startup sample here. So it's really the startups are taking benefit of the scaling advantages. Then we look at productivity. So again, our measure here of productivity is coming from GitHub. It's a measure of how many contributions we have per user. So we kind of scale things up to the firm level. So we're looking at the total number of contributions divided by the total number of users on GitHub. And we're breaking this out by public and private contribution. So one other caveat here, right, is we're not accounting for how long the employee is working. So we're just looking at a productivity per capita measure. This could possibly incorporate, for example, increases in time that employees are spending on the job, right? So we're not able to measure that precisely. What we can look at is how many contributions per user we have. And again, the improvement in productivity is concentrated in those remote startups after the pandemic. Again, a really large increase in productivity that's coming from primarily private contributions, right? So those are the contributions that we think correspond most to things that the firm is really doing. It's really internal software projects that are going on inside the company. By contrast, when we look at all firms that are going remote, we kind of see much smaller effects, kind of a sort of more like a zero on the private contribution. So what this sort of says is that startups seem to just be doing remote work better, right? They're scaling a lot faster when they go into remote work status, and they're more productive, at least as measured by this proxy of how many code commits are these employees doing while at these companies. So this is less than 10 years. But yeah, we've also we've tried other ways of defining it, looking at size, for example, and things are kind of pretty similar if we do other cuts. Yeah.
If you're going to distinguish between startups, and doesn't that absorb the distinction between startups and incumbents?
So there's some time variation there. Sort of so we allow young to kind of vary, but what the fixed effect is doing is basically soaking up the indicator for young, right? So like the young indicator is getting absorbed. Okay, so we also did this in event studies, looking across time. So this is the coefficient on the triple interaction. So what is the effect of being a remote firm, that is young, where the time effect is now broken out over half years? So the increase in labor scaling, i.e. the increase in growth experienced by young firms, really shows up after the pandemic. So that's kind of consistent with the timing of when we would expect these labor scaling benefits to really materialize for startups. Another caveat is we don't, unfortunately, have data that goes further after this point. So after the sort of tech recession kicks in, you might imagine these labor scaling benefits might be different. Unfortunately, we don't yet have the data to look that far forward. So this is primarily in that period, kind of the first few years out of the pandemic, when there were huge opportunities for tech firms that were able to kind of grow quickly. And it's a similar story when we look at GitHub contributions. So again, triple interaction, being a young firm, being a remote firm, looking at that effect over time. They're more productive. This is measuring just the private contributions. That effect is really showing up after the pandemic. So that's sort of, again, indicating that the timing of when these productivity benefits materialize is sort of consistent with remote work being the key driver of these productivity advantages for startups and young firms in particular. Okay, so try to convince you that startups are doing really well with remote work. Question is why? What is it about young firms? What is it about startups that helps them grow faster and experience these productivity advantages? So the main story that we're going to emphasize is the ability of startups to access workers in multiple geographic markets. So this is first just a descriptive plot looking at the number of locations divided by the number of employees. So it's a measure of geographic dispersion among startups. So the more locations I have per employee indicates that I have more employees spread out across the country. This is looking across all startups, not breaking out remote, non-remote. But the point here is just that, especially when we go a couple of years into the pandemic, startups are really much more likely to have employees all over the country compared to what they were doing before, right? So startups are much more likely now to be remote first and to be able to hire, even in their first set of employees, people all over the country. So they're accessing a national labor market now, whereas before they were limited to more local labor markets. And this is a defining characteristic of startups relative to established firms, because again, established firms may already have offices in multiple locations and can already hire across the country. They've just made the fixed cost expense of doing so by establishing all these different locations across the country. Startups can jump directly there by hiring remotely. So to see how important that factor is, we then do the full triple interaction, and we ask whether these employees are in fact from more locations, i.e. whether there is a triple interaction effect of being post-pandemic, being a remote firm, being a young firm, and having employees across more cities, MSAs, or states. Right? So measuring geographic dispersion as a function of whether startups that go remote are more likely to have employees all across the country. And we find strong evidence of that. So it's really these startups are able to access workers. So the increase in geographic dispersion across all startups is really coming from these remote startups that are hiring all over the country. So this is directly related, of course, to their scaling advantages, because they can now access a much broader pool of talent across the country. And this result is less identified, but speaks to the productivity advantages of being able to access all these workers in different locations. So what we've done here is we're doing a regression on productivity as the outcome variable. So again, this GitHub contributions per employee. And now we're subsetting based on whether the startup is growing to more cities or not. So we're basically splitting the distribution of location dispersion. We're going to subset on startups that are going into more cities versus the ones that are not growing geographically, and similarly by MSA and similarly by state. And so the comparison is between the productivity advantages for startups that are growing and expanding to multiple locations versus those remote startups that are not growing across locations as much. So, to be clear, this is two endogenous variables that we're connecting here. We're just trying to see the association between location dispersion and productivity. And across all three of the different cuts, what you find is that the productivity advantages of startups are really concentrated in those startups that can access multiple geographic locations, that are growing and expanding to multiple regions. And so that sort of suggests that the ability of startups to access those different regions is related to the productivity advantages that they seem to enjoy. OK, but other things to be going on too. So we're taking a look at other channels that might be related to this. So something I thought would be important is office rents. And so the test here is whether the growth of remote startups is coming from locations, headquarter locations, where rents are high relative to locations where rents are low. Right? So if office rents and financial constraints were the key problem, then you would think that those startups that were located in San Francisco, New York, that were previously paying all these high office rents, well, now they can get rid of their lease, they can expand much more, so we should see higher growth in those areas. And we do, in fact, see higher growth in those areas. It's just not as statistically precise as some of the early results. So there may be something to this scaling advantage coming from being able to get out of your office lease, and we're working on doing more data work to better connect lease level data to look at this in more detail, because this is right now a market level measure of your exposure to higher low rent areas. We don't observe the same pattern actually with productivity. So that's the sense in which this is more of a mixed result. So the productivity advantages of remote startups are not very closely linked to how much their market charges in rent. So then we looked at a measure of managerial kind of composition. So I'd be very curious if anyone else has thoughts on better measures of how to measure. What we kind of want to get at is whether the management is basically flat or whether there's lots of levels of hierarchy within the firm. Because that's something that we've heard a lot is if you have a flat team, it's a lot easier to manage these people remotely, as opposed to if you have a giant organization, many levels of hierarchy. For that, you really need people to kind of come into the office. And so our attempt to try to measure that level of flatness is through an HHI measure. So we basically look at the dispersion of employees across roles. So i.e., how many employees are there present across different roles, and a high centrality firm is one in which many employees are kind of clustered in a few set of roles, versus a low centrality firm is one in which many employees have all sorts of different roles, indicating possibly greater managerial complexity, right? So it's not a hugely significant difference. We find some evidence of higher growth in these sort of flatter structures. So the ones that are high centrality, the ones that have many employees concentrated in few roles, seem to have slightly higher growth, but not super significant. They also seem to have some productivity advantages. That would be consistent with the idea it's easier to monitor and deal with employees when there's a flatter structure here. But again, I don't want to make too much of this result. Now we kind of get into another thing I thought would be important, but it goes the other way. Is the way we do research, I guess. So what I thought would happen is that the ability of these startups to access all these different markets would mean that they get better people. Right? That would make sense. I can hire across markets, and therefore I should hire the best people. In fact, they're hiring people that are no better or maybe even worse than before, and despite that, they're able to achieve these productivity advantages. So the way we measure that is by looking at how many contributions did these people have at their last job. Right? So looking at taking advantage of the linkage of these people across different occupation spells. And basically what we find is that these people that the remote startups hire basically were worse employees at their last job. So they had a lower contribution productivity level. So this is really interesting because it tells us that it's not that you're just hiring better people. It's that there seems to be something about the match quality. You're finding people that are themselves not that great, but your whole team kind of becomes great when you're able to add all of them together across different geographic markets. And it's a similar story when we look at other measures of employee quality based on education. So whether these employees went to like Ivy League schools or top 100 schools, et cetera, there's no real difference in educational quality of these employees. So again, there's something maybe more intangible about the quality of these employees, something more about the bilateral match between the firm and the employee that kind of makes a difference, rather than just the raw level of talent or ability that these employees kind of seem to have that makes a big difference. Of course, it's also consistent with the remote startup just having some sort of managerial advantage in dealing with these remote workers in the first place as well. Okay, same thing here, just looking at another measure of education. So just to wrap this up, key things that we find are that remote startups seem to be doing a lot better. They're exhibiting faster scaling, higher productivity growth, and the main reason seems to be their ability to access a broad national talent pool. This might help explain why it is that we're seeing some of these very large companies like Amazon trying to push people back into the office while remote startups are still quite active. It sort of suggests that one important catalyst for improved business dynamism in the future may come from remote work, because these startups are in a position to really take full advantage of it. It also has implications for the spatial dispersion of economic growth, because we're finding that it's not just tech workers in San Francisco anymore, right? Tech workers can work for these startups wherever they are across the country. So you have the possibility for more dispersed economic growth happening everywhere. But this is really the first step of our project, and really hope to do more to better understand where are these startups, where are their employees actually located. We want to look at what are the implications of this shift in productivity and scaling for these startups. We want to really separate out against other mechanisms that could be going on here in parallel, and then really figure out, can we dig further into this idea that remote startups have this geographic advantage. All right, thank you very much. Hoping to hear more of your comments.
So I was thinking of a potential channel that would reconcile, recruiting people who are looking like they're not better, but somehow they're more productive working at the startups when they're working remotely. And one channel is the incentive structure of a startup versus the publicly traded company. So a lot of these people working for tech startups are there with stock options, and they're willing, they're waiting for the big buyout or merger. And this is why you don't need to be monitored so heavily when you're working remotely. There's no point of going lazy, as was pointed out, right? Whereas for publicly traded companies, these might be shirking in related work.
Yeah, that's a good idea. We should think about that. And then on our to-do list is also to get information of financing rounds for these companies. Seed funding, whether they go IPO, et cetera. Another thing that might be going on is. Just a hypothesis is that the office savings, even if they're not directly linked to the scaling advantages for these firms, might allow you to raise less capital down the road. So there's dilution benefits of going remote as well.
Great paper. Two quick things. One is it'd be good to match it to venture. Maybe you're already going to do it. Yeah, at least for tech, getting venture funding is a pretty clear metric of success. The other thought would be, I think there's another margin, which is the ability to start a firm. So actually, earlier in the week, I was up talking to one of the partners of YC who was saying, well, one of the big upside, well, they have differing views on this, but one upside of being a remote is you don't necessarily immediately need to leave your current job. So you can potentially start a new firm, try it out, and if it takes off, then at that point you leave. But you may get a much bigger pool of people that enter into it.
Yeah, so we actually looked into that second thing a little bit, and we found that happening a lot to large companies. So large companies that went remote actually saw more of their employees leave to start other companies. And so that, you can think of as these remote workers that are, in silence able to kind of start their own companies. That's great for economy-wide productivity, but it could be another reason why large companies don't like that relative to small companies where you're monitoring everybody. It's hard to have your own second startup when you're already working at your first startup.
So, great work. And one thought is there's a recent paper by David Shu and Prasanna Tambe at Wharton in management science, where they looked at startups and the job applications of startups, and they found two main findings. They found that those applications, when they were remote versus in person, attracted more geographically diverse applicants, which is consistent with this. But they also found it attracted more gender-balanced applicants and more minorities. So given that you have LinkedIn data, I was wondering whether we can look at that as well. And that might explain why previous performers who didn't do well might be turning around, because if they were if that result is gendered, then there might have been some distractions at home or in the office that are go away with remote work, right? So the gender composition change might explain that.
Yeah, great points. Yeah, we'll have to extract it from the names, I guess, that we have on LinkedIn.
Thanks for the interesting presentation. I had a question about the measure of productivity. I guess I was wondering, the number of commits seems like it is likely very correlated with productivity, but you could also imagine that there would be sort of reasons to break up the same amount of work into more commits if you're working, for example, remotely, where there is a higher value to being able to signal that you're being productive when someone can't kind of observe you working in person. So I was wondering if there's a way to kind of substance adjust the commits, like whether you have data on like the number of lines of code changed per commit or something, just so you know that it's actually that they're being more productive and not that they're just trying to signal productivity more when they work from home.
Yeah, I just got a lead from someone here on a data set that might help us go down that road. But the best we can do for now is the fact that we already have a control for basically remote. So we're controlling for the average level by which remote firms experience a change in their. We were really worried about this possibility happening in general. So for that to affect our story, it needs to be the case that that effect is differentially happening for startups relative to other established companies.
I just wondered if you're observing any international employment going on in this data set, or is this within a single firm? Is this Argentinian software engineers being hired by U.S. startups, or is it?
I have nothing to say on the wage level of the Argentinian employees, but because this is all of LinkedIn, so we have every person there, whether they're a U.S. employee or not. So we haven't broken it out by U.S. versus non-U.S., but we absolutely should.
Oh, cool.
I just wanted to make a comment about remote startups, and it seems like the startups were remote even before COVID. So I was just wondering what you think changed when COVID hit. And one hypothesis is that there's now a larger preference for workers to work remotely. So maybe there are workers who were employed by larger firms who are not remote, and now they're more likely to move to startups. So I feel like you can observe that directly in your LinkedIn data to establish that as a mechanism.
Yeah, so we observe the location of the worker on LinkedIn. So that helps us also to kind of tease out some individual characteristics of them. And so we can, if I understand your question, it's both the fact that startups are going remote, but also there's this preference shift, as other papers have talked about, which increases the geographic pool of remote workers for these startups to hire from. And I think, there's maybe something about the location of these workers that we can look at to basically try to find people that were, probably in person before the pandemic, but are now going remote at an individual level, and whether that's the kind of feature that's driving our results.
So the startups were not remote before COVID. They turned remote.
Well, so our measure of remoteness from Scoop is post-pandemic. So it's measuring the kind of current status of remote work. Some of these remote startups were also remote before the pandemic, but I think even in startups, there's been a huge shift and increase in how often that's happening.
Hi, great presentation. I had two questions. One is, have you thought about GitHub profiles can be private, fully private, and not just the repositories, right? And that's kind of a strategic decision on firms' parts. So like I have a friend who tried to find her GitHub profile at one point, and she has one, and then none of her work repositories are on there, not even as private. So yeah, that's one question. And the second one is, do you have any idea of whether the causal mechanism could run the other way? Sense of like, if I'm a dynamic firm, I might be more comfortable with going remote because I know that my employees have a shared vision or whatever that keeps the firm together.
Yeah, I mean, we basically can't observe the private, private individuals. I mean, one thing that is kind of nice actually in the public contributions of the public profiles, often people will put stuff there if they want to get hired elsewhere. right? So it's if you want another job, that's like a big incentive for you to have a public-facing profile. And then on the endogeneity point, yeah, we're trying to work on that. We have some ideas for instruments and things like that to kind of better tease out the identification. But be curious if you have any other thoughts.
Very interesting study, and I'm interested in your LinkedIn data because I'm also using LinkedIn data, and actually I observed that LinkedIn's business model is doing really well, and there are more users over the last few years. I'm wondering if all the employees just sign up on LinkedIn, how will that be counted in your sample? Will that be counted as a new hire? Will that be counted in the employee growth or things like that? Yeah.
Yeah, but if I just create a profile for the first time over the pandemic, right, I'm still going to put my start date. I'm going to backfill that at a certain point. So we're only including people that started at the company, like in the post-pandemic period, not just when their profile showed up.
I think we need to move on to the final. Thanks so much.
Cool. Thanks.
Yeah, so rounding out the afternoon is Erica talking to us about work from home and commercial real estate.
Thanks so much to the organizers for including this paper on the program, and thanks to everyone for staying awake for the last talk of the day. I'm excited to tell you about work from home and commercial real estate effects on bank balance sheets, credit availability, and a little bit the real economy, although some of that is future work. This is joint work with Elliot Annenberg and Yusuk Kim. All three of us are employees at the Federal Reserve Board, and so the usual disclaimer applies. The analysis and conclusions that we present today are our opinions and not those of our employer. Okay. All right, so work from home has reduced commercial real estate valuations quite dramatically. This is something that we've already seen in this conference. ARPIT has a paper on this, and Simon talked to us about it. And a key channel through which CRE valuation declines could affect the broader economy is through bank exposure to loans which are backed by distressed properties. In this paper, we focus specifically on banks because they hold the majority of CRE debt. 61% of CRE debt is on bank balance sheets. Especially that debt is sitting on the balance sheets of small and regional banks. These banks can hold up to 40% of their total assets in commercial real estate. So these valuation declines, especially in combination with high interest rates, this could harm bank balance sheets and cause decrease in credit availability, and in extreme situations, as is studied by Zhang et al., bank solvency problems. But in this paper, we're going to focus on the effects of the work from home shock on distress at banks and the CRE credit supply. And to some extent, we'll study whether there are spillovers to other types of credit supply. In particular, we'll focus on residential real estate. All right, so what do we find? We find that banks which are more exposed to the work from home shock experience more loan distress as measured by loss provisions and charge-offs. They reduce their CRE lending by more as a result of this loan distress. So a 1 standard deviation increase in exposure is associated with a 5 to 10% decrease in originations. And a 1 standard deviation increase in distress is associated with a 31 percentage point decrease in the centered growth rate of new originations and a 0.08 percentage point increase in the probability that a bank just stops lending in a given county. That sounds like a small number, but it's 40% of baseline, so we think it's economically quite significant. And we find some evidence that there are spillovers to other types of lending. So these are like negative point estimates, but they're very noisy. And then we find that our CRE lending results aggregate. So in counties where incumbent banks' national CRE portfolios are more exposed to the work from home shock, we find that there is some substitution of credit supply from banks to non-banks, but not enough to make up for the overall pullback in credit supply. And this is conditional on changes in demand. Okay. All right, so in this project, we use 2 main data sources. The first one is CoreLogic. People might be more familiar with using CoreLogic in residential real estate settings. Turns out, same data, same file. They cover all the commercial real estate properties as well. And the advantage of this data is we get address-specific loan-level data. So that gives us sort of full geographic coverage of the entire United States. It covers all lender types, so banks and non-banks. And in particular covers all sizes of banks. So we could have used in this project regulatory data from the Y14 filings. Those only cover the largest banks, and so we didn't want to be restricted to that sample. This CoreLogic also doesn't have any cutoffs for the value of properties or transaction sizes. So another common data set that's used in commercial real estate is the RCA data set. We've done some analysis to show that this data set covers only half of loan originations by smaller banks. And so we didn't want to have that sort of skew in our sample. The downside of CoreLogic is that we get no data on loan performance, right? This is originations data only. Nevertheless, there's enough information provided that we can construct for every loan an expected path of amortization. And we can use that to aggregate up to a bank market panel of loans, loans outstanding, and originations at the quarterly frequency. Then we match this to the call report. So the call report are sort of regulatory filings that the banks make every quarter, and it tells us about total CRE loans outstanding, the commercial real estate delinquency rate, charge-offs, loan loss provisioning, and total assets. Okay. So our first step is we're going to calculate a bank-specific measure of exposure to the work-from-home shock. I don't think I have to tell people in this room too much about the Dingle and Neiman shocks. But what we're going to do is we're going to calculate for every county the share of total employment in that county that was teleworkable in 2019 Q4. And then what we're going to do is treat the work-from-home share times essentially a post-dummy as an exogenous shock to CRE evaluations. We've also done all of our analysis where we replace the Dingle and Neiman share with the CPS measure post-COVID, and the results are basically the same. Okay. Here's the map that you guys have probably all already seen. The thing we normally highlight is just that this measure of the work-from-home shock varies a lot across the United States. It's correlated with population density, but not perfectly. Okay. All right, so the next step is then to aggregate this measure of the work-from-home shock across counties to the bank level. And what we do is we essentially take a weighted average of the work-from-home share across counties, that all the counties that a bank has exposure in, where they have CRE loans outstanding, and then we weight the work-from-home share of that county by the share of all CRE loans that on that bank's balance sheet that are exposed that are located in that particular county. So we get a lot of variation in the number of counties that a bank is lending in, and we get therefore a lot of variation in this measure of exposure. Okay. All right, so now we're going to move to our main regression analysis. We're going to try to estimate the effects of exposure on commercial real estate lending. We're going to assume loan origination follows a Poisson distribution with a conditional mean that depends on their exposure, some controls, and some fixed effects. So when our main measure of originations is actually going to be a count measure. This is because it's actually slightly less noisy than using origination volumes, but we'll have some results on volumes as well. Okay, so we have our exposure measure. Our controls are going to include flexible controls for bank size, for CRE loans outstanding, the share of total assets that are commercial real estate, and the share of CRE loans that are owner occupied, and other bank characteristics like the capital ratio, the number of counties that they lend in, all measured before the pandemic. And then we're going to include county by year fixed effects. So this means that the variation that pins down our beta, or our coefficients on exposure, is coming from within county year variation in bank exposure. So that's coming from variation in the portfolio county share. This identification is similar to Quadra and Mian, but the idea is that if there are two banks that are lending in the same county, they essentially face the same demand for CRE lending, but if one is more exposed to the work-from-home shock in the rest of their CRE portfolio, in the rest of the country, they might be less likely to extend new credit in this county. Okay. And indeed, that's what we find. So we find that banks with more exposure reduce their CRE lending by more. This happened immediately, after the pandemic onset. It actually got worse in 2023 after the rate hike. And sort of give you some quantitative benchmarking here, we find that a 1 standard deviation increase in exposure is associated with a 5 to 10% decrease in originations post-pandemic. Okay, so our measure of exposure is a little bit of like a weird metric. It's a little bit hard to understand what it means from like a magnitudes point of view. And so instead we're going to look at the effect of we're going to move to looking at the effect of distress on CRE lending, because that's the channel that we have in mind, right? So we're going to think about, okay, if I'm very exposed to the work from home shock, I expect that my loan portfolio will underperform, and that might be the reason that I pull back my lending. Okay. So we're going to regress growth in originations on distress, controls fixed effects, and we're going to use an instrumental variable strategy. All right, so our outcome variable is going to be a centered growth rate, or centered growth in originations. That's going to be the same as a regular growth rate, except that the denominator is the average of post-pandemic originations and pre-pandemic originations. Why do we use a centered growth rate? It's basically a lot less noisy because we're dealing with very small numbers. The number of loans is very, in a given county is very coarse. This centered growth rate is going to be bounded between 0 and 2. This is going to reduce the impact of outliers. And it's also going to treat positive and negative growth rates symmetrically, which we think is nice. And we're going to start by just looking at the intensive margin of lending. So we'll drop all bank county observations where either pre or post-pandemic originations is 0. And then we'll do a separate analysis for extensive margin. All right, our measure of distress is also going to be require, I think, a little bit of explanation. So it's going to be sort of a cumulative and forward-looking measure of distress. First, we're going to look at all your loans that you've charged off. So charging off a loan means that the bank has essentially said, we're not getting this money back, right? So we're going to add up all cumulative charge-offs that the bank has experienced over the course of the pandemic. And then we're going to add to that provisioning that the bank has made against expected future losses. So that's like the change in loss provisions as of 2023 Q4 relative to 2019. Now, the problem with running this regression via OLS is that distress may be endogenous. So measurement error is going to be introduced by matching bank names across data sets. So our distress measure is coming from the call report, and our growth and originations measure is coming from CoreLogic. So that introduces potential measurement error. But there's also an omitted variable that we think is really important here, which is that maturing loans are more likely to be in distress, but they're also more likely to need to be refinanced. So at the same time as you have high distress, you're also potentially going to have high originations just because of the timing of when loans come due. So what we're going to do is we're going to instrument for distress with exposure. Okay, and here's what happens when we do that. The first column here shows our OLS results. The second column is the first stage, which you can see is quite strong. And then the third column shows origination growth in counts, and then the fourth column is the IV with origination growth in dollars. So what we find is that a 1 standard deviation increase in distress is associated with a 31 percentage point decrease in the centered growth rate of originations. We've also done a version of this regression with like a leave one out style instrument where we measure bank exposure leaving out the focal county, and the results are almost exactly the same. On the extensive margin, we also find that an increase in distress is associated with a reduction in the probability that banks lend at all or continue to lend in a given county. So a 1 standard deviation increase in distress is associated with a 0.08 percentage point increase in the exit probability, or the probability that you stop lending at all, and essentially no impact on entry. So far we've shown that banks with more exposure reduce their lending by more along both the intensive and extensive margins. And now we want to ask whether this pullback in CRE credit supply by exposed banks led to a decrease in overall credit supply at the aggregate market level. So it could be the case that there is no impact on aggregate lending because people who are, landlords and people who are demanding credit could substitute from more exposed banks to less exposed banks or to non-banks, right? And non-banks are sort of active lenders in this market. They include insurance companies, pension funds, and CMBS lenders. And in before the pandemic, they made about 40% of loans. So to run this regression, we're going to calculate total growth in originations. So that's bank plus non-bank originations at the county level in the post-pandemic period relative to the pre-pandemic period. Then we're going to calculate a county level measure of bank exposure. So that says for all banks that have originated in this county before the pandemic, what's the weighted average of their total exposure, where we weight each bank by their volume of pre-pandemic of originations. And then we control for as many things as we can. So pre-pandemic county characteristics like population and urban share, the Dingle-Neiman work from home share, the share of office loans outstanding, how large the banks are, that sort of thing. And then we also control for a number of post-pandemic changes, so changes in the unemployment rate, and then the realized work from home share of the county. And in this regression, we're going to weight counties by their 2019 Q4 employment levels. All right. So when we do that, we find that the average county experienced a 30 percentage point decrease in the growth rate of new originations due to the bank lending response primarily to the work from home shock. So the first column shows that total response. If we break that down in terms of total bank lending and total non-bank lending, we can sort of see very clearly that this effect is driven 100% by the bank pullback in bank originations, and there is actually some substitution to non-banks, but not enough to make up for the pullback by banks. Okay. Then we want to ask if these effects spill over to other types of lending other than commercial real estate lending. And we do find that there's like a negative coefficient, but it's very noisy and not statistically different from zero on residential real estate lending. Okay. So we find that the work from home shock had large negative effects on bank credit supply by increasing loan distress and damaging bank balance sheets. And that this pullback in credit supply from more exposed banks led to large negative aggregate effects. So these non-banks and less exposed banks did not fully offset the pullback by the most exposed banks. And so we're still working on trying to dig into these results a little bit more. We're trying to see if we can exploit variation in exposure to different property types to try to identify heterogeneous treatment effects by property type. I actually have plenty of time, so I can sort of show you what we've got on this. Okay. Yeah, so if we, instead of calculating our exposure metric for all CRE loans outstanding, we can do it for every property type and estimate a very similar model as we did before, except that we have every single different type of exposure for every property, or every type of property in the same regression. Here's what we find. We actually find that it doesn't really matter which of your property types is exposed. This is not just an office effect. All types of CRE appear to be contributing to a pullback in credit supply. So we think that's pretty interesting, and we think there are some reasons why that might be. So the first is that a lot of retail is actually, like before the pandemic at least, was supposed to cater to office workers. If there aren't office workers anymore, the retail's not going to be doing so well. To the extent that business travel has fallen, hotels may be suffering. Multifamily seems like it's a totally different story, but there have been a lot of shifts in housing demand and multifamily. There was a lot of multifamily supply increase over the course of the pandemic. So that might be some of the channel there. And it might also be the case that not all office properties were adversely affected as much, right? For example, in the suburbs in the US, office properties haven't been doing quite as badly. So we thought that was kind of interesting. We're going to dig into that a little bit more. There we go. And then we're also working on looking at some real outcomes. So were there, do these pullbacks in credit supply lead to a reduction in building permits or new construction or other sorts of outcomes? So thank you so much for your attention and for staying with me till the end of the day. And I'm looking forward to your questions and comments. Thank you. Arpit has a mic first. Okay.
Great paper. Just in terms of the real effects, I'd be curious if you looked at CNI lending at all as an outcome, because given where CRE exposure lies in the distribution of banks, those banks also do a lot of CNI lending, whereas it's like the very largest banks do tons of agencies and residential lending and not as much CRE.
Yeah, that's definitely something that's on our list, but we haven't done it yet.
Yeah, very interesting work. Two thoughts. One, you have development loans in here.
Yes.
And I suspect that's driving most of it, because these are, again, the ones that can't be securitized. And if you the way to kind of test this would be take out loans from if it's 2018 or later, it could be a development loan. So it'd just be interesting to see how much of this is driven by development loans. My second thought on multifamily, you're not saying multifamily overall is adversely impacted. You're saying multifamily exposed to work from home. And I suspect there's two things going on with that. One, the multifamily that is exposed to the work from home shock was probably CBD. And these are cities where there's been especially a reallocation of housing towards the suburbs, right? So these are where, and the other thing, and I'm going to go out on a limb here, but I think a lot of the cities that were very exposed to the work from home shock actually had declines in population overall. And I don't know that that's necessarily related to work from home, but we do know that these cities have had losses in population. So I think that's probably what's going on, because your multifamily stuff is really surprising.
Yeah, we think so too. So we're definitely going to try to dig into it a bit more. In our aggregate regressions, I think we control for change in population. So that, to some extent, we should maybe try to do that in some of our other specifications and see if that explains some of the story.
Thanks. That was great. Super interesting. Three things. One is you must have looked at it. Have you looked at, I'm sure you have, the credit ratings. Do you see similar?
Yeah. So we don't have loan level credit ratings, but we could try to merge in other types of credit ratings.
Oh, is it on the bank level credit ratings?
Yes, we could try to do that. We have not merged those in.
Be consistent. Unless I'm missing something, wouldn't it be the more banks that are more exposed should see their credit?
Should see their credit ratings go down.
Surely that's going to, given everything I've read in the news, but it would be a good, pre-check almost.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. We hadn't thought to do that, but we could. We are controlling for things like the capital ratio. So.
Another thought was kind of related to Andrew's point, which is, I think it would be good to just check you have controls for where your loans are times population density, or I don't know whether it's a red versus blue place. This is going to start to get quite collinear to work from home.
Yeah.
But it would be nice to know it isn't just say work from home is high in tech places, and that's due to the tech slowdown, and that's why with all of these, I believe the story, but it would be good just to throw in some control for, I don't know, exposure to tech or exposure to pop density or something. Make sure it's just not entirely being driven from that.
Yep.
One tiny presentation thing I was thinking it would be great to have an example about one SD change of exposure. For public consumption, if you could compare, say, a bank with half its loans in San Francisco
to a bank
and the rest average to a bank to half its loans in Miami, and the rest it would just be useful to kind of
just to provide a little bit more context, I don't have any perfect examples off the top of my head, but I think, as you would expect, the large banks are the ones that are primarily exposed to the big areas that were hit by the largest work from home shocks. So the large banks are lending in San Francisco and New York, and the small banks actually are lending in areas that were less hit by work from home. And so we actually found that to be sort of reassuring. Yes.
So one quick question, super interesting stuff. I was wondering if you could study for any substitution effect. So are these banks just depressing their overall loan portfolio, or are they moving the loan somewhere else? Given Arpit's paper, are they lending to more high growth startups, for instance, right? So I'm curious if you have other lending categories.
Yeah. I think this relates to Arpit's question about whether we've looked at C&I loans, and I think we haven't done it yet, but we can sort of see if there are spillovers to other lending categories. I think C&I is kind of the one that people are most interested in, but we can look at all categories to the extent that they're reported in the call report.
I think kind of related to that, I would be curious as to, in terms of the total number of originations coming down, whether you're seeing that more for small balance lending or large loans, or if it's sort of a mix.
Yeah, so most of our results are, like I said, for sort of counts of all loans. We're looking at heterogeneity now too. That's on the to-do list right now. So first of all, we're going to look and see if there are differences by bank size and then also by loan size. We'll report back when we get those.
Very interesting study, and I'm curious whether these banks with greater exposure based on your measure are big banks or smaller banks, because my understanding, first of all, as an accounting professor, I'm very excited when you talk about balance sheet. And I actually checked those banks' balance sheet, and I found these big banks, like these commercial real estate loans, do not really account for a large portion of their loan portfolio. And actually, for banks like New York Community Bank, which had a lot of trouble, the smaller regional banks in these big cities actually have more exposure based on my understanding of the data. Is that also consistent with your data?
Yeah, so I mean, definitely the banks with the most CRE on their portfolios are the banks with about $1 billion to $100 billion in assets. As far as, does that translate into our measure of exposure based on work from home? The relationship flattens out a bit. And so it's not actually, in the end, that strongly correlated with bank size. Because there's so much geographic variation in where these regional banks and small banks are actually lending. So small banks, yes, they have more CRE on their portfolios, but there's the geographic variation in where they lend ends up determining their exposure as we measure it in the end. Thank you all so much.